A retired lawyer, still grieving the loss of his wife, opens his home to 5 orphaned children with no past and no names. What begins as an act of compassion slowly unravels into something far deeper as each child brings light, laughter, and unanswered questions. But when one of them starts, remembering things he shouldn't, a forgotten truth begins to resurface. One that could change everything Richard thought he knew about justice, fatherhood, and the price of the past. This is another beautiful story from Mr. Edwards' Tales, where you feel the true emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Let us know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Richard Cole didn't recognize the number at first. The screen blinked with a Connecticut area code he hadn't seen in years. He hesitated before answering, his thumb hovering for a second longer than necessary. "Mr. Cole," said a voice, hoarse and aged but unmistakable. "It's Benjamin. Father." Benjamin. The name struck him like a faint aftershock. Soft, but unsettling. Richard stood up from his armchair instinctively, the phone pressed tighter against his ear. "Benjamin, it's been what, a decade?" he asked. The priest didn't laugh. 16 years since I saw you in person. But I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important." Richard listened in silence as Benjamin recounted what had happened. Or rather, what hadn't. A fire had destroyed the original St. Mary's orphanage last winter. Most of the children were relocated. All but 5. The state never followed up. The temporary shelter, a decaying colonial house in the outskirts of New Haven, was never supposed to house children long term. "But they're still there," Benjamin said. 4 little girls and a boy. No last names, no birth certificates. No one came for them. And I'm too old for this now. They need someone. "Richard, you were always Emily's best hope." Richard sat back down, heart thudding beneath his ribs. He drove to New Haven the next morning, unsure of what to expect. The priest had given him an address and warned him of the state of the house. Still, Richard wasn't prepared for how desolate it looked. The front gate creaked open with a whine that seemed to echo through the bones of the building. Cracks split the plaster of the outer walls, and boards covered some of the windows. A swing in the yard hung by one chain, spinning in the wind. On the porch sat a boy, alone, knees pulled to his chest, eyes fixed on the horizon like he was waiting for someone he knew would never come. "Hello," Richard said carefully, stepping out of his car. The boy didn't move. "What's your name?" The voice that came back was calm and too old for 9 years. "Gabriel." Behind him, the front door creaked open, and 4 girls peeked out. Naomi, the oldest, with sharp eyes, Clara, hiding behind her, Isla, sucking on her thumb, and June, the smallest, with messy pigtails and bruises on her knees. Father Benjamin appeared last, his gait slower than Richard remembered. "There they are," he said with a tired smile. "Meet the children no one came for." Richard didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at each of them, taking in their postures, their eyes, the way they clustered together like fragile things, holding each other up. Naomi watched him carefully, her hand protectively resting on Isla's shoulder. "They've been together since the fire," Father Benjamin said beside him. "They lost everything in one night. Bedrooms, blankets, even memories they didn't know they had." Richard cleared his throat. "Any idea where they came from?" Benjamin shook his head. "We found them in the wreckage." "No. Parents. No records. Just 5 kids sitting in the snow, waiting." The silence that followed was heavy. Gabriel had walked closer without a sound. "Are you taking us somewhere?" he asked. Richard looked down, startled by how the boy could read intention before it was spoken. "Maybe," Richard said. "I came to see." "My sisters," Gabriel said plainly. "They stay together, or we stay here." The other children looked at him, then at Richard. The word sisters hung in the air, unspoken but accepted. Gabriel wasn't related to them, not by blood, but his presence was clearly their anchor. Richard nodded once. "All 5 of you, or none." Gabriel gave no smile, only a nod. That was enough. On the drive home, the car was heavy with silence, but not an uncomfortable one. June fell asleep first, curled into Isla's lap in the back seat. Clara kept her eyes out the window, tracking trees like they held secrets. Naomi sat upright beside Richard, asking measured questions. "Do you live alone?" "Yes." "Is it far?" "Not anymore." But Gabriel sat directly behind him, unreadable. Richard could feel the boy's gaze in the rearview mirror, sharp and unwavering. As they drove through the outskirts of New Haven, a rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. Emily liked the rain, Richard murmured to himself, forgetting he wasn't alone. Was she your wife? Gabriel asked, catching the name. Richard's grip on the wheel tightened. She was. How did she die? The question hit like a punch. That's not something I talk about, he replied. People say that when they're hiding something, Gabriel answered. The bluntness of it made Richard's breath falter. He didn't respond. The silence returned, but it was no longer soft. Gabriel leaned his head against the window, and Richard couldn't help but wonder what kind of 9-year-old asked questions like that. He didn't sleep the entire drive. The house hadn't felt like a home in years. Emily's pictures were still on the hallway walls, and the kitchen still held her teacups, untouched since the funeral. As Richard opened the front door, the children entered slowly, cautiously, as if stepping into someone else's memory. Naomi wandered first, peeking into the living room, and then the study. This place smells like stories, she said, like old paper. Isla clung to Clara's hand as they tiptoed upstairs. June walked straight to the kitchen and opened the fridge. There's juice, she exclaimed, startling everyone. The simple delight made Richard smile for the first time that day. Only Gabriel didn't explore. He stood in the doorway, unmoving, staring at a photograph above the fireplace. Richard and Emily, arms wrapped, sun behind them. She looks kind, he said quietly. Richard followed his gaze. She was. Did she want kids? Gabriel asked. Yes, more than anything, Richard replied. But we waited too long. Gabriel nodded slowly. Maybe we didn't. The comment unsettled Richard in a way he couldn't explain. Later that night, as the children unpacked in the guest rooms, Richard found Gabriel sitting in Emily's old reading chair. I can't sleep, the boy said. I keep hearing a name in my dreams. Martin Graves. Richard froze. The name was a ghost. Richard hadn't heard it aloud in over a decade. He sat down, his knees aching more than usual, and looked at Gabriel. Where did you hear that name? He asked. I don't know, Gabriel replied. It's just there, in my head. Sometimes I see a face, but it's blurry, and there's always fire, screaming, and a woman crying. Richard's throat tightened. He felt the weight of years pressing down on him, and for the first time since Emily's death, fear crawled up his spine like a living thing. Gabriel, he said slowly, I need you to tell me everything you remember about these dreams. The boy looked up, eyes steady, ancient. Sometimes I think I'm not supposed to be here, he said. Sometimes I think I was sent. The words were too heavy for a child, and yet Richard saw no lie in them. The photo of Emily looked down on them from the mantel, and for a moment Richard swore he felt her presence. If this boy was sent, he thought, then for what? And by whom? He had taken 5 children into his home to honor a promise. But now, he realized, one of them might hold the answer to a truth he'd been trying to bury for years. The next few days transformed the silent halls of Richard's home into something unrecognizable. Laughter bounced off the walls like sunlight spilling through open windows. Naomi and Clara took to the upstairs bedrooms like they were decorating kingdoms. Naomi hung up drawings with tape, while Clara insisted on organizing the books on the shelf alphabetically. Isla danced barefoot through the hallway with June chasing after her, giggling as she flung one of Richard's old ties like a ribbon in the air. The kitchen, which had once been a place of stillness and solitary coffee, now pulsed with energy. Cereal on the floor, spoons clinking, juice boxes half finished and forgotten on the counter. Richard stood in the doorway more than once just watching. The chaos was overwhelming, but it wasn't unwelcome. It was life. It was noise. It was everything Emily would have begged for. Still, amidst the whirlwind of young voices and tiny footsteps, there was one who stood apart, Gabriel. He didn't complain or misbehave. He simply watched, always one step removed, as if trying to memorize the joy he didn't know how to join. Richard often caught him staring at the family portrait above the fireplace, eyes unreadable. One evening, long after the girls had fallen asleep, Richard walked downstairs for a glass of water and found the front door slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. He stepped outside, barefoot, the porch cold beneath his feet. Just beyond the steps, under the silver blue wash of moonlight, stood Gabriel. The boy was facing the yard, head tilted back, eyes fixed on the sky like he was waiting for something to fall from it. "Gabriel?" Richard's voice was gentle. The boy didn't turn. "Do you ever look at the stars and feel like they're watching you back?" he asked. Richard hesitated. "Sometimes," he replied. "When Emily died, I did a lot of staring at the sky." Gabriel turned then, slowly, his expression unreadable. "I see her in my dreams. A woman, blood all over her hands. She's crying, screaming, and there's always someone else. A man. He says the same thing every time. He's not your father." The words hit like a knife. Richard swallowed hard, his voice tight. "Do you know who the man is?" Gabriel shook his head. "No, but the way he says it, it's like he hates me, like I stole something from him." Richard didn't answer. He just rested a hand on Gabriel's shoulder and guided him back inside. The next morning, Richard wandered into the attic for the first time in years. Dust clung to everything like a thick grey veil. Old boxes, furniture covered with sheets, the remnants of a life Emily had once tried to plan. He wasn't sure what he was. Looking for answers, maybe. A clue, a connection. Gabriel's dream unsettled him not because of its content, but because it had touched on a name he hadn't spoken in nearly 2 decades. Martin Graves. The last time Richard saw him was in court, his eyes burning with resentment as the gavel struck the verdict. "You'll lose everything you love," he had whispered. Richard opened an old toy chest that had belonged to his niece and rummaged inside absent-mindedly. Beneath a worn-out teddy bear, something sharp pricked his finger. A small, folded envelope. Yellowed with age, sealed and with a single name. Scribbled across the front, Gabriel. The handwriting wasn't Emily's. It wasn't familiar at all. His stomach dropped. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he took it downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at it under the light. When he finally peeled it open, the message was simple. He is not your father. Remember that. No sender, no date, just dread. Unable to contain the rising unease, Richard called Tess. She was the only person he trusted enough to handle something that felt this sensitive. A former law partner turned child welfare advocate. Tess was sharp, methodical, and emotionally grounded. She arrived that afternoon, coat still wet from the rain, and immediately noticed the change in Richard's demeanor. "This is more than a guardianship issue," she said after hearing the basics. Richard handed her the letter. "It's not the first time Gabriel's heard that phrase," he said. Tess read it twice, her lips pressed in a tight line. "You think it's related to his dreams?" "I think it's too specific not to be." Richard leaned in. "And the name he mentioned, Martin Graves." Tess didn't need to ask who that was. She had been there during the trial. She remembered the threats. "Are you saying you think Gabriel is connected to Graves?" "I'm saying," Richard said slowly, "that I don't believe in coincidences, and I want to know the truth before it finds me first." Tess nodded and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to call someone I know, a private investigator. He left the force early, couldn't handle the system anymore. But if there's anyone who can track down Gabriel's past, it's Elliot Park." Elliot Park arrived 2 days later, all worn leather and tired eyes. He had the look of someone who had seen too much and survived it anyway. He sat in Richard's study, flipping through the sparse documents Richard had managed to gather on the children. "No last names," he muttered. "No birth records. All 5 of them appeared at the temporary shelter after the fire. No photos, no witnesses." Richard shook his head. "Only that they were found sitting together in the snow outside the ruins, holding hands." Elliot paused. "Unusual behavior for children with no connection." Richard said nothing. "And this Gabriel," Elliot continued, tapping the boy's name on the adoption form. "He's the one who keeps referencing someone who may be connected to the man that threatened you?" "Yes," Richard replied. "But he doesn't understand what it means." Elliot leaned back. "Kids know more than they say. But the mind, trauma has strange ways of surfacing. Dreams, flashes, instincts." He closed the folder. "Let me dig. If there's any record of who dropped those kids off, I'll find it. But Richard," he leaned forward, "if this is what you think it is, you need to prepare yourself. Graves wasn't just a criminal. He was obsessed." Richard nodded. "That's what scares me." That night, as the children settled down, Richard stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the soft glow of the hallway light stretch across the floor. Naomi whispered a bedtime story to Isla. Clara was brushing June's hair. Gabriel wasn't in his room. Richard found him again by the fireplace, staring at the photograph of Emily. "You loved her a lot, didn't you?" Gabriel asked. Richard sat beside him, his hands folded. "More than anything." Gabriel tilted his head. "Did she ever think you'd be a father?" Richard smiled faintly. "She hoped, but we waited too long." Gabriel was quiet. Then, "Do you think someone can become something they were never meant to be?" Richard glanced at him. "Yes," he answered. "Sometimes life puts you in a place you never imagined, and sometimes that's where you find what matters most." Gabriel nodded slowly. "I don't know if I belong here." Richard looked him in the eye. "You belong here because you're wanted here. That's what matters." The boy didn't answer, but for the first time since arriving, he leaned his head against Richard's shoulder, only for a moment, and in that brief contact, Richard felt the full weight of what was coming. Elliot Park's investigation moved faster than Richard had expected. In less than a week, the former detective returned with unsettling news and a thin manila folder that seemed to hum with tension as he handed it over. They sat across from each other in Richard's dimly lit study, the fireplace crackling quietly between them. "I went back to the state's archived records," Elliot began, pulling out a page. "Buried beneath dozens of incident reports tied to the orphanage fire, there's a handwritten note from a now-retired Sister Helena. She served at the original St. Agnes shelter before it. Burned down." He slid the note across the table. Richard picked it up and read. "Unidentified male, dropped-off boy, approximately age 3. No name offered. Man wore a grey coat, walked with a limp. Boy called himself Nate, recorded as Nate G for short." Richard's throat tightened. "G?" he asked. "E," though he already suspected. Elliot nodded slowly. "Helena transferred shortly after, but the shelter kept Nate G until the fire." He paused. "There's more. An internal memo references the possibility of the boy being connected to Martin Graves." The name landed like a hammer between them. Richard leaned back, stunned. "So the boy I've taken in might be his son." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced the floor of his room in silence, the name Nate Graves circling his mind like vultures around a carcass. Down the hall, the children were asleep, or at least pretending to be. He'd checked on them twice. Naomi was curled around Isla. Clara clutched June's small hand, but Gabriel's door was closed. No light peeked out from underneath. He stood outside it for a moment, debating whether to knock, to open, to confront. Instead, he turned and walked back toward his study. There, he poured a finger of whiskey he hadn't touched in years and stared at the envelope Elliot had brought back, a copy of the intake form from St. Agnes. Nate Graves, written in Sister Helena's firm, looping cursive. Richard whispered the name like a question to the empty room. It made much sense. The dreams, the voice in Gabriel's head, the odd familiarity he had with Emily's death. Martin Graves had sworn revenge 16 years ago. Could this truly be his plan? To place his own child in Richard's care as some twisted echo of justice? The thought sickened him. Yet beneath it all was a heavier fear. What if Gabriel knew and chose to come anyway? Gabriel's behavior over the following days became increasingly erratic. One morning, he helped June tie her shoelaces and carried her backpack to the breakfast table with a soft smile. He even tried a bite of her cereal when she insisted. But later that same afternoon, he locked himself in the bathroom for nearly an hour and wouldn't answer anyone. Naomi tried knocking. Isla cried. Richard stood outside, fists clenched, as he heard the faucet run without pause. When Gabriel finally emerged, his face was pale and his hands were red, raw from scrubbing. "I just don't feel clean," he muttered before walking past everyone and disappearing into the guest room. That evening, Richard found another envelope beneath the porch mat, just like before. No stamp, no return address, just Gabriel's name in the same cryptic handwriting. Inside, a single line. Soon he will return to his truth. The rage that coursed through Richard's veins was immediate and uncontainable. He crushed the letter in heart. This wasn't just a coincidence or a sick prank. Someone was watching them. Someone wanted to steal the boy. And worst of all, Gabriel might be starting to believe them. Richard met with Tess the next day, desperation visible in the dark circles under his eyes. They sat in the sunroom while the children played in the backyard. From where they were seated, they could see June pushing a toy truck along the patio while Naomi braided Isla's hair. Gabriel sat apart on the swing, his legs dangling, not moving. "I don't know what to do," Richard confessed, voice low. "Every day I feel like I'm losing him a little more. And now these letters." Tess leaned forward. "Have you talked to him?" "I try," Richard admitted, "but it's like he's wearing someone else's skin. One moment he's present, kind, gentle, and the next, it's like a switch flips. Cold, calculated." Tess exhaled through her nose. "Do you believe he knows who he is?" Richard shook his head. "I think he suspects, or fears, it, but he hasn't said the name again. Not since that night under the stars." Tess looked toward the swing. "We need to know what he remembers, not just what he dreams." Richard rubbed his hands together. "Then maybe it's time I show him the papers, the name, the truth. He deserves that, even if it destroys the peace we've tried to build." Later that evening, Richard called Gabriel into the study. The boy entered quietly, his expression unreadable as always. Richard gestured to the seat across from him, placing the file gently on the desk between them. "I need to tell you something," he began. Gabriel didn't speak, but his body tensed slightly. "We've been trying to figure out where you came from, who brought you to the orphanage. There's someone who may be connected to you." Gabriel's eyes flicked toward the folder. "His name is Martin Graves." Silence followed. The kind of silence that has shape, weight, breath. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Richard asked. Gabriel's lips parted slightly. "I've heard it. In my sleep. In my head." "We believe he may be your father," Richard continued. "The man who dropped you off wore a gray coat and had a limp. That matches his description." Gabriel lowered his gaze. "Is he bad?" Richard didn't lie. "Yes, very." A long pause followed. "Am I bad too?" The question was a whisper, barely a sound. Richard stood, came around the desk, and crouched in front of him. "No, you are not your blood. You are not your nightmares. You are the choices you make." Gabriel's eyes shimmered. "Then I choose you." The next morning, Gabriel sat alone on the porch, the file still in his hands. He had asked to read it again, quietly, without interruption. Richard allowed it. The boy had been silent for nearly an hour when Naomi joined him, dropping beside him with a huff. "Clara said you were acting weird again," she said. Gabriel didn't respond. "Are you okay?" she asked after a moment. He nodded. "Just thinking." Naomi glanced at the papers. "That your real name?" "Nate," Gabriel murmured. "I used to be Nate." Naomi was quiet for a while. "Does that change who you are now?" Gabriel looked at her, surprised by the depth of the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't feel like a Nate. I feel like Gabriel, like someone new." Naomi leaned back against the post. "Then be Gabriel. People get reborn all the time. Clara says I used to cry every night in the orphanage. Now I only cry when June hogs the blanket." Gabriel laughed softly. It wasn't much, but it was real. As the wind blew through the trees and the sunlight warmed the porch steps, he folded the papers closed. He had a past, but he was choosing a different future. Gabriel sat on the edge of his bed, the file folder still pressed between his palms like a confession he wasn't sure he wanted to make. Richard stood in the doorway, hesitant, watching the boy breathe in slow, careful rhythms as if each inhale held a question and each exhale a secret. "You read everything?" Richard asked gently. Gabriel didn't look up. "Yes." There was silence for a beat before Gabriel's voice returned, strained but steady. "The letters. I've been hiding them since the day I got here." Richard stepped inside and sat at the foot of the bed, close but not imposing. "Why, didn't you say anything?" Gabriel finally looked at him. "Because I didn't know what they meant. And then, I was afraid you'd send me away if I believed them." Richard shook his head slowly. "I'm not afraid of your truth. I'm only afraid of someone trying to take you from this home." Gabriel's lip quivered, but he held firm. "What if he's really my father? What if I'm made of everything he is?" Richard reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not defined by who you come from. You're defined by what you choose to become." That night, after the others were asleep, Gabriel sat with Clara on the couch, both of them wrapped in a thick knit blanket. She was humming something tuneless and quiet, brushing June's doll's hair, while Gabriel handed her rubber bands like it was a sacred task. "You're different lately," Clara said without looking up. "Quieter, but nicer." Gabriel shrugged. "I think I'm just tired of pretending I'm alone." Clara finally met his eyes. "You never were. You just acted like it." Gabriel nodded and leaned back into the cushions, letting himself feel the warmth, the weight of comfort he hadn't realized he was missing. From across the hallway, Naomi watched them from the corner of the stairwell and smiled faintly. It was the first time she'd seen Gabriel laugh, softly, quietly, but real. The shift was slow but noticeable. He began helping Isla with her puzzles, listening to June's made-up stories, even reading books with Naomi late into the night when sleep wouldn't come. And yet, something in his eyes always lingered, an alertness, like he was waiting for a knock that hadn't come. That waiting ended the night the whispering started again. The wind had picked up after midnight, rustling the trees like whispers across the roof. Gabriel lay still in his bed, eyes open, listening. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again. A voice, low, male, not in his head this time, but outside. He got up quietly, avoiding the creaking floorboards, and moved toward the window. The backyard was dark, faintly lit. By the porch light, a figure stood just past the tree line, not moving, watching. Gabriel's breath caught. He stepped back, heart racing. "I see you," the voice murmured from the shadows. "You're not his. You're mine." Gabriel's stomach turned. He slammed the window shut and backed away from it, then ran out of the room and into Richard's. "There's someone out there," he cried. Richard bolted upright, eyes wide. Within minutes, Elliot Park was on the phone and at the house, reviewing the footage from the security cameras Richard had recently installed. They huddled in the study, the children asleep upstairs, unaware. Elliot paused the video on a blurry frame. "The vehicle parked across the street. It's registered to a man named Harold Quinn. He used to work with graves. He's known for doing dirty jobs." The room went cold. "This isn't just surveillance," Elliot muttered, adjusting the screen. "This is a message. They want us to know they're watching." Richard rubbed his face with both hands, a mix of fear and fury simmering in his chest. "Why now?" he asked. "Why wait all this time?" Elliot stood, pacing. "Because Gabriel is old enough now. Old enough to be manipulated, to be taken." Richard's face darkened. "They're not taking anyone." Tess arrived shortly after, summoned by a shaky voicemail. She walked in with her coat half-buttoned, eyes scanning the room. "Is everyone safe?" Richard nodded. For now. Gabriel was sitting on the steps, listening. When Tess spotted him, she crouched down, eye level. "Hey," she said gently. "Do you know who the man was?" Gabriel shook his head. "No, but I knew he was there for me. I could feel it, like I was being pulled." Tess didn't flinch. "You don't have to go anywhere. Not unless you choose to." Gabriel's response was firm. "Then I choose to stay." Elliot looked between them, his voice lower. "We need to be ready. If they come again, it won't be to watch. It'll be to take him." Gabriel's eyes hardened. "Then I'll be ready too." Over the following days, Richard doubled the house's security. Motion sensors, reinforced locks, and camera systems were installed in every corner of the property. Elliot had a contact run full backgrounds on Graves's former associates. Most were clean, but Quinn wasn't. He had been spotted in nearby neighborhoods just weeks prior. Gabriel became more alert, but not withdrawn. He stayed close to the girls, checking on them during the night, escorting them to the kitchen during breakfast, even reading to June when she had trouble sleeping. The other children noticed, but didn't question it. Naomi, however, confronted him one afternoon. "Are you scared?" she asked. They were sitting on the swing set behind the house. "Yes," Gabriel admitted, "but not for me." Naomi tilted her head. "Then who?" "All of you. This family. I don't want him to take what I finally have." She placed a hand on his. "You're not alone anymore. So if he comes for all of us." Gabriel looked away, tears in his eyes but refusing to fall. "Then we stand together," he whispered. The wind carried their voices into the trees, but the determination in them remained rooted, unmoving, unshakable. That night, Richard sat with Gabriel at the dining table long after everyone had gone to bed. A single lamp glowed between them, casting shadows over the documents Elliot had printed, criminal reports, old photos of Martin Graves, and surveillance snapshots of Quinn. "He won't stop," Richard said. "Not unless we make him." Gabriel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a folded letter from his pocket, another one, found that morning in the mailbox. He handed it to Richard. It read, "He's leading you into weakness. Come back to where you belong." Richard felt sick. "We have to cut this off at the root," he said. "No more waiting." Gabriel looked at him, resolve in his young face. "What do you want to do?" Richard placed his hand over his. "I want to fight for you, but only if you're ready." Gabriel stared into the shadows and nodded. "Then let's end this." Outside, the wind blew again, but this time the house didn't flinch. It stood, alive with the warmth of a new family, breathing the breath of people who had found something to hold on to. And within it, Gabriel had made his choice. Gabriel sat silently in the corner of the dim living room, the flickering light from the nearby table lamp casting long shadows over his face. The plan had been discussed over the course of several days, meticulously, cautiously, with every possible risk laid out on the table. Richard hadn't wanted it. He had argued, he had yelled, but in the end, he had understood. "If we keep running," Gabriel had said firmly, "then we're letting him decide who I am." And so, Elliot crafted the trap. A carefully crafted social media post under an anonymous account, hinting that Gabriel was curious about his biological father and planned to meet him. It included just enough information to bait a man like Martin Graves, a name, a location, a time, and a whisper of vulnerability. Now everything was in motion. Tess would go with Gabriel, posing as his legal guardian. Elliot and Richard would wait nearby, undercover, with two plainclothes security officers. The chosen place was a rundown cafe on the edge of town, just outside city surveillance range, but close enough to reach within minutes. Gabriel stood now, slowly slipping into the gray hoodie Tess had brought him. "Do I look scared?" he asked. Richard approached, kneeling to face him. "No," he whispered. "You look ready." The cafe was nearly empty when they arrived. Tess ordered tea neither of them intended to drink, and guided Gabriel to the corner booth where the windows offered a full view of the street. The tension sat heavy between them like an invisible wall, pressing down with every passing second. Gabriel tried not to fidget, but his fingers tapped against the table in a slow rhythm. "You don't have to talk," Tess reminded him gently. "If he comes in and you feel unsafe, we walk." Gabriel nodded but said nothing. His eyes remained on the door. The seconds felt like hours. Then the bell above the entrance jingled. A man stepped inside, tall, gaunt, his frame wrapped in a heavy coat despite the spring warmth. His gait was unmistakable. One leg dragged slightly behind, the limp still present after all these years. The man removed his cap, revealing graying hair and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. But his eyes were sharp, piercing, predatory. "Hello, son," Martin Graves said, approaching the booth. Gabriel didn't move. Tess gripped his hand under the table. Martin sat down without invitation, his eyes locked onto Gabriel like a magnet finding its charge. "You've grown," he said. "You look just like her." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Who?" he asked, voice low. Martin smiled, a twisted, unrepentant thing. "Your mother. She had your eyes. But you—" He leaned closer. "You have my soul." Tess's grip tightened, but Gabriel didn't flinch. "You're not here for memories," Gabriel said. "You're here to take me." Martin's grin widened. "I'm here because you belong to me. You were born to carry on what I started. Everything I lost, my freedom, my life. It was all so you could rise from it." He looked at Tess with mild disgust. "He doesn't belong in a house with bedtime stories and soft men pretending to be fathers. He belongs with blood." Tess's face remained stone. "You sent letters," she said. "You stalked a child. That's not fatherhood. That's manipulation." Martin ignored her. "They don't understand what's inside you," he said to Gabriel. "But I do. You feel it, don't you? That fire, that hunger." Gabriel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What I feel is disgust." Martin blinked. "You're lying to yourself. You'll come with me." Gabriel looked him dead in the eyes. "I'm not going anywhere with a murderer." The cafe fell silent. Outside, headlights flashed. The trap had closed. Before Martin could react, the door burst open. Richard stepped in first, followed closely by Elliot and the two undercover agents. Martin reached into his coat, too fast. Elliot yelled, "Hands up!" The two officers closed in instantly. One grabbed Martin's wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced force as the other disarmed him. A small folding knife clattered to the floor. "You set me up!" Martin spat, struggling. "You traitorous little bastard!" he screamed at Gabriel. But the boy didn't move. Richard walked over, stopping between them. For a second, he said nothing. Then, in a voice calm and ice-cold, he spoke. "You came after my family. You thought you could plant a ghost in my house, but he's not yours." Martin growled through gritted teeth. "He's my son. You'll never be enough for him." Gabriel stood now, his voice steady despite the tremble in his chest. "You're right. He's not enough. He's more than enough. Because he chose me." Martin lunged, but the officers held him back. Gabriel moved beside Richard and looked at Martin one last time. "I chose him, and I'll keep choosing him every day." The words rang louder than any scream. Martin's eyes darkened with defeat as the cuffs clicked shut. Outside the cafe, rain had begun to fall in quiet, uneven drops. Gabriel stood beneath the awning beside Richard, his breathing shallow but even. Tess joined them, umbrella in hand. "You did it," she said to Gabriel. "You faced him." Gabriel nodded, then turned to Richard. "I meant what I said in there." Richard looked down at him. "I know. Does it feel strange, hearing it out loud?" Gabriel asked. "It feels like something I didn't know I needed," Richard answered. They began walking toward the car as Elliot spoke with local authorities. The police would take Martin from there. It was over, at least for now. In the back seat, Gabriel leaned his head against the window and whispered, "It doesn't feel like victory." Richard looked back at him. "It's not. It's survival. But you've earned something more than survival now. You've earned peace." Gabriel closed his eyes. "Then I want to learn how to live with it, not just exist." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will. Because now, you don't have to do it alone." In the silence of the ride home, something inside Gabriel settled for the first time in his life. Not entirely at peace, but no longer at war. Back home, the house was quiet. The girls had been kept unaware of the meeting for their safety, but they noticed the shift as soon as Gabriel stepped through the door. June ran up and hugged his leg tightly. "Where'd you go?" she asked. Gabriel knelt down and hugged her back. "Nowhere bad," he said. "I just went to make sure we're safe." Naomi stood near the staircase, her arms crossed. "Did it work?" Gabriel nodded. "He's gone, for good this time." Naomi walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Then let's never talk about him again." Gabriel agreed. Later that evening, as Richard tucked June into bed and Isla asked for a second story, Gabriel wandered into the study and stared at the picture of Emily above the fireplace. Richard entered quietly. "She would have liked you," he said. Gabriel smiled faintly. "You think so?" "I know so." Gabriel turned. "Do I still get to be yours?" Richard's answer came without pause. "You always were." That night, for the first time in years, Gabriel slept through without waking. No whispers. No shadows, just silence and a family waiting for morning. The courthouse was silent in a way that carried weight. Not just the heavy hush of a room filled with solemn people, but the kind of silence that feels thick, almost sacred. The kind where memories echo louder than footsteps. Gabriel sat straight on the witness bench, his hands clenched in his lap. He had rehearsed the words in his mind for days, but the reality of speaking them in front of strangers, judges, prosecutors, his former captor, was a storm he hadn't fully prepared for. Still, when the clerk called his name, he rose. His steps to the stand were measured, slow but steady. The judge, a stern woman with silver-framed glasses and a no-nonsense tone, asked if he was ready. He nodded. "Please speak clearly," she instructed. And so he did. Gabriel recounted the letters, the threats, the whispers in the night. He described the cafe meeting, the knife, the hatred in Martin's eyes. But then his voice changed, calmer, more certain, when he spoke of Richard. "He didn't share my blood," Gabriel said clearly, "but he gave me something more. He gave me a home. He listened. He stayed." There was no doubt in his tone. "I choose him as my father, and I always will." The courtroom murmured, soft whispers echoing after Gabriel's declaration. The prosecutor, a woman with a kind but piercing voice, followed with her closing arguments. The defendant, Martin Graves, not only violated his parole, but did so in a manner that directly endangered a minor, his own biological child. He manipulated, stalked, and threatened this child. He is not a man seeking connection. He is a man seeking control. Martin sat still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes flicked to Gabriel only once, and never again. The defense had little to stand on. Their arguments were weak, fractured, relying on vague claims of paternal rights and emotional distress. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses, Elliot, Tess, and Richard, were direct and unwavering. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned with the sentence. Martin Graves is hereby sentenced to 23 years in a federal correctional facility, with no eligibility for parole due to repeated violations and endangerment of a minor. The gavel fell, a sound sharp enough to fracture the tension in the room. Gabriel didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath since the day he arrived at Richard's door. The past had finally been addressed, but peace would be something he'd need to learn how to hold. They returned home as the sun began to set, a golden halo washing over the white shutters and porch railing like a promise of something new. Richard didn't say much during the ride. He drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting protectively on Gabriel's shoulder in the back seat. Tess followed in her own car, while the girls, Naomi, Clara, Isla, and June, waited anxiously at home with a celebratory banner they had insisted on painting themselves. It read, "Welcome home, Gabriel. Forever." When the front door opened, the cheer that erupted was loud enough to shake the walls. June practically launched herself into Gabriel's arms. "Did you do it? Is the bad man gone?" she asked, her tiny hands gripping his shirt. Gabriel bent down, hugging her tightly. "He's gone," he said, "and he's never coming back." Isla clung to Clara, eyes wide with cautious relief, while Naomi gave a firm nod as if saying, "I knew you could do it." Then Richard stepped forward, holding a manila envelope. "If you're ready," he said softly, "we can make this official." Gabriel looked at him, breath catching in his throat. "All of us?" Richard smiled. "Every single one." They sat around the dining table later that night, 5 new birth certificates freshly printed and stacked in the center like sacred relics. Each one bore the same last name now: Cole, Naomi Cole, Omi, Clara Cole, Isla Cole, June Cole, and finally, Gabriel Nathaniel Cole. Richard handed each child their document one by one. Naomi held hers with a prideful smirk. Clara ran her fingers over the printed letters like they were written in gold. Isla asked Richard how to spell the middle name again, and June announced, "I'm gonna show mine to the moon." But it was Gabriel who stared the longest. He didn't say anything at first, just held the paper in both hands and traced the name with his thumb. "I always wondered what it would feel like," he murmured, "to belong." Richard leaned over and whispered, "You always did. You just didn't have the paperwork yet." Gabriel looked up, and for the first time since stepping into the house all those weeks ago, he smiled, genuine, whole, and unguarded. "I have a family," he said aloud. And just like that, the words were no longer an idea. They were real, rooted, and wrapped around him like warmth on a winter morning. As the celebration continued with chocolate cake and juice boxes, Richard stepped outside to the porch for a moment of stillness. The stars were beginning to blink into view. The laughter from inside filtered through the screen door, a sound he'd once believed he would never hear in this house again. Tess joined him quietly, arms crossed. "It's done," she said. Richard nodded. "The trial is. The fear, maybe not." Tess studied his face. "You think someone else is still out there?" "I don't know," he replied. "Martin had too many years to plant seeds. Associates, favors. I don't think he worked alone. Not entirely." Tess nodded slowly. "You'll need to be ready." Richard looked through the window at the children. "I am, but I'm not doing this alone anymore." Tess smiled. "No, you're not." Behind them, Gabriel appeared in the doorway. "You okay?" he asked. Richard turned. "I am now." The 3 of them stood there for a moment in silence, not because they were afraid, but because the future had opened a door, and none of them wanted to walk through it carelessly. A storm had passed, but the clouds hadn't, fully cleared. That night, as the children slept and the moon climbed higher into the sky, Gabriel sat at his bedroom window, arms wrapped around his knees. The room looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because he no longer viewed it as temporary. This was home. Yet, something lingered, just outside the boundaries of safety, a whisper of uncertainty. He remembered Martin's last words before being dragged away. He's not done. You'll see. Gabriel knew better than to ignore warnings. He reached under his bed, pulled out a small notebook, and began to write. Things I know. I'm not him. I have a choice. This house is mine. I love them. But then he wrote, what if there's more? What if someone else is watching? He closed the notebook and placed it in his drawer. Whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone. Not anymore. As he slid under the covers, shadow passed quietly across the front lawn. Too quick to trace, too silent to detect. But inside the house, the doors were locked, the lights were warm, and 5 children slept with the comfort of knowing they were chosen. Not by blood, but by love. And that love would stand against anything that tried to return from the dark. The rain began softly at first, tapping against the windows with a rhythm that might have felt calming on any other night. But by midnight, it had evolved into a full-fledged storm. Thunder cracked overhead like distant artillery fire, and the wind howled against the house with enough force to shake the shutters. Richard was still awake, reading in his study, when the sharp ping of an alert from the security panel shattered the silence. Perimeter breach, the screen flashed. Motion detected at the rear fence. He stood immediately, the book falling from his lap as he moved to the console. Another alert, garage motion. A cold pit formed in his stomach. Tess, he called, as he bolted into the hallway, already dialing Elliot. We've got movement. 2 locations. Tess appeared from the guest room in a robe, eyes wide but clear. You get the kids. I'll check the cameras, she said, sprinting to the living room monitor. Richard raced up the stairs, adrenaline drowning every trace of fatigue. Within minutes, all 5 children were in the safe room in the basement. Isla sobbing, June clutching Gabriel's arm, Naomi whispering, "We'll be okay," like a chant. Richard locked the steel door behind them just as Elliot's voice came through the phone. Hold tight. I'm 2 minutes out. Tess stood in the living room with a flashlight in one hand and a poker from the fireplace in the other, watching the black and white footage on the monitor. 2 men moved through the rain, both cloaked in dark clothing, but the camera caught the glint of something metallic at one's waist. One of them's got a knife, she muttered. Then she paused the footage, zooming in on a partial face. Her eyes narrowed. That's Paul Drayton. He was with Graves years ago. Did time for aggravated battery. He's not here to negotiate. The second man remained obscured, but the way he moved, fast, fluid, professional, suggested he wasn't a common thief. Just then, headlights appeared on the screen. Elliot's SUV screeched into view. The intruders scattered, but they didn't get far. The camera, outside the east fence, caught the moment one of the men slipped on the slick grass, crashing down as Elliot tackled him. The second was cornered by the house, disarmed by the 2 security officers Richard had hired after the trial. Sirens wailed in the distance. Tess exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. That could have gone very differently, she said as Richard reappeared. They weren't just here to scare us. Richard looked toward the basement door. They were here to finish what Martin started. When the police had taken the men into custody and the storm began to ease, Richard gathered the children in the living room. Their faces were pale, eyes wide from the adrenaline, but no one cried anymore. Gabriel sat in the center of the couch, June curled into his side, and Naomi flanking him like a silent shield. Everyone's safe, Richard said softly, kneeling so he could meet all their eyes. No one's going to hurt you. His voice cracked slightly, and Gabriel noticed. Were they with him? He asked. Richard nodded. Yes, at least one of them, Clara whispered. But he's in prison. How could they? People like Graves don't need to be free to cause trouble, Tess answered. Gently. But they underestimated us. Naomi leaned forward. What happens now? Richard looked at each of them. Now we protect what's ours. Stronger locks, more cameras, reinforced fences. We'll build a wall they can't climb. Gabriel shook his head. No, we build something they can't break. Not just fences. Us. The room fell quiet. That night, while the rest of the house returned to sleep in uneasy waves, Gabriel sat alone in his room, a single letter in his hands, the final one. It had arrived days earlier, but remained unopened, until now. The envelope was yellowed and thin, written in the same jagged handwriting Gabriel had come to dread. He unfolded the paper slowly, fingers trembling, but his gaze remained steady. "Letting you go is what a man must do." That was all it said. No threats, no signature, just one line. Gabriel stared at it for a long time, searching for meaning, or that maybe wasn't there. It didn't feel like closure. It didn't feel like love. It felt like surrender. One final manipulation disguised as nobility. He stood, crossed the room, and lit a match from the box Richard kept in the drawer for emergencies. He held the paper over the flame. It caught, quickly, curling black at the edges before collapsing into itself. When it was gone, Gabriel didn't feel free, but he did feel finished. He opened his notebook and wrote one line. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the scars, but it stops them from becoming chains." Then he turned off the light and let himself fall into sleep. No dreams, no whispers, only silence, and the quiet breathing of a boy beginning to become himself. The following day, Richard met with Elliot and Tess in the study. Papers cluttered the desk, blueprints for an upgraded alarm system, quotes from fencing companies, and contact logs with police officials. "We were lucky," Elliot said, folding his arms. "But luck is temporary. We need long-term strategy. You're not just protecting 5 kids anymore. You're guarding targets." Richard clenched his jaw. "Then I'll become a fortress. I'll do whatever it takes." Tess looked at him for a long moment. "That might mean making enemies with people who have resources. Are you prepared for that?" Richard didn't hesitate. "They came for my children. I will not wait for them to come again." From upstairs they heard the girls playing, June's laughter echoing faintly. Then, Gabriel's voice, calling her name with a lightness Richard hadn't heard in weeks. Tess stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the yard. "They still believe in safety," she said. "Let's make sure they're right." That afternoon, they installed additional cameras and updated every digital lock in the house. Richard walked the perimeter himself, checking each point. When he returned to the porch, Gabriel was there, holding a box. "What's that?" Richard asked. "The last of the letters," Gabriel said. "Can we throw them out together?" They stood by the fire pit in the backyard, just the two of them. Gabriel placed the box gently into the flames. Together they watched as smoke curled into the sky, lifting the remnants of fear and memory into the air where it could no longer return. Richard placed a hand on Gabriel's shoulder. "You sure?" Gabriel nodded. "I've carried him long enough." As the ashes rose, Richard turned to him. "What do you want from the future?" Gabriel didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, clearing now after the storm, and then at the house behind them, where 4 girls waited and laughter still lived. "I want peace," he said finally, "and I want to protect it, like you did for me." Richard nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do, together." The fire burned low, but the bond between them felt stronger than any wall or lock. Echoes of the storm still lingered in the trees, but the house stood tall, not because it was built from stone, but because love had been layered into its walls, resilient, unbreakable, and chosen. And in that house, a boy named Gabriel Cole was no longer haunted. He was home. The morning of Gabriel's 10th birthday began with sunlight pouring through the windows and the smell of chocolate cake rising from the kitchen. June had woken the earliest, long before the others, and insisted on decorating the living room with handmade paper stars she had cut the night before. Naomi took charge of the balloon station, filling each one carefully, while Clara and Isla worked on stringing colored lights along the staircase. Laughter floated through the house like music, each note a reminder of how far they'd come. Richard stood in the kitchen, watching the chaos with a soft, tired smile, occasionally dodging a balloon that drifted out of Naomi's grip or stepping over June's scissors on the floor. Tess arrived shortly before noon with a bag full of party favors and one very real gift, a framed copy of Gabriel's official adoption certificate, now sealed in gold. "He should have this today," she said quietly. "This day matters." Richard nodded, accepting the frame, his fingers brushing the name printed at the top, Gabriel Nathaniel Cole. It wasn't just a name. It was a declaration. In the backyard, Gabriel was already dressed and waiting, sitting cross-legged on the grass, watching the sky like he expected it to answer. The celebration was not extravagant, but it didn't need to be. There were no magicians, no rented bounce houses or glittering clowns. What filled the yard was far more meaningful: joy, safety, and the unmistakable sound of children who believed they were home. Gabriel opened gifts slowly, each one handed to him with care by his sisters. Isla gave him a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, with her name scribbled inside the cover. "You said you like books with lawyers," she shrugged. Clara handed over a drawing she'd made, Gabriel wearing a cape, standing in front of a courthouse with the word justice shining above him like a sun. Naomi gave him a chess set. "Because your brain works too fast for regular games," she teased. June, predictably, gifted him a small plastic ring she found in a cereal box. "It's magic," she whispered. "Just for you." Gabriel laughed, hugging her tight. Then Richard stepped forward, holding a neatly wrapped box. Gabriel peeled the paper slowly, revealing a leather notebook with his initials embossed in gold. "For your first arguments," Richard said. "I expect big cases." Gabriel's hands trembled slightly as he held the gift. "I want to be like you," he said, "a voice for people who don't have one." Later, when the cake was cut and the sun had begun its descent behind the trees, Richard and Tess stood at the edge of the yard, watching the children play tag in circles, Gabriel always just a step ahead. "There's something poetic about today," Tess said, arms crossed gently. "A birthday after all the shadows. A boy who now believes in light." Richard nodded, eyes never leaving Gabriel. "I've thought a lot about everything I lost," he said. "Emily, the years I spent alone, the silence that filled this house. And now somehow I've gained something I never expected. I'm not just raising children. I'm building futures." Tess glanced sideways. "Do you ever regret it?" "Not for a second," Richard said. "Even the danger, even the fear. If it brought me to this moment, I would live it all again." Tess smiled. "Then you've earned this peace." As if sensing their gaze, Gabriel turned and waved them over. "Picture time," he shouted. Naomi had set up a timer on her tablet. Everyone gathered beneath the oak tree, arms around each other, smiles wide. Gabriel sat in the middle, Richard behind him with a hand on his shoulder. The shutter clicked. A new memory captured. A family sealed. As the other children ran back toward the cake table, Gabriel lingered in the yard with Richard. The boy looked up at him, then toward the camera still perched on the stool. "Do you think we'll look the same in 10 years?" he asked. "Not a chance," Richard chuckled. "You'll be taller than me, probably arguing in front of a courtroom, and I'll be somewhere in the back, pretending not to cry." Gabriel smiled. "Can you promise me something? Anything. That no matter what happens, we stay together?" Richard crouched down so they were eye level. "Gabriel," he said quietly, "we're not just staying together, we're growing together. Every day. That's what families do." Gabriel nodded slowly, then leaned in and whispered, "I'm not part of the darkness anymore, Dad. I'm light now." Richard's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. "You always were. You just needed someone to tell you." Behind them, Tess captured the moment on her phone. No timer, no pose. Just a boy and his father, frozen in the golden haze of something hard-earned and deeply rooted. In that single frame, the storm was gone, the past forgiven, and the future beginning. Inside the house, the photo was soon printed and framed. It joined the others on the hallway wall: first day of school, official adoption, game nights, and pancake mornings. But this one held something special. It marked the moment the last shadow lifted. The children now had chores, routines, weekend pancakes, and bedtime stories that didn't end in fear. Naomi had started writing poems. Clara organized a courtroom in the garage for mock trials. Isla painted sunflowers on the walls of the playroom. June declared herself queen of the living room and made Gabriel her knight. He played along, smiling more, retreating less. He no longer checked the locks 3 times before bed. No more nightmares. No more hiding letters. He had been reborn, not through magic or miracle, but through choice, through love, through the commitment of one man who decided that family wasn't who you were born to, but who stayed when the rest of the world walked away. That truth echoed through the walls now. It hung in the pictures, lived in the laughter, and took root in the way 5 children and 1 father lived each day, deliberately, gratefully, together. Outside, dusk settled over the Cole household, but inside, light continued to bloom. Richard sat by the fireplace with a book, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. Gabriel sat nearby, scribbling something in the leather notebook. "You working on your first case already?" Richard asked. "Kind of," Gabriel replied. "I'm writing about justice, about how it's not just in courts, but in choices and love." Richard smiled. "Sounds like you've already won the case." The flames crackled softly, and somewhere upstairs, June could be heard negotiating bedtime with Naomi. Clara's voice rose in protest, something about borrowed socks, and Isla laughed so hard she hiccuped. Gabriel looked up from his page. "You hear that?" "What?" Richard asked. "That sound," Gabriel said. "That's what home sounds like." The moment held. The house, once filled with silence and ghosts, now thrummed with life, with joy, with family. Gabriel looked back to his page and added one final line before closing the notebook. "I was born in shadows, but I chose the light, and now I live in it. And in that light, the Coles, each of them chosen, each of them healed, carried forward, not as survivors of a past, but as authors of their own future." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to support us by hitting the like button, subscribing to Mr. Edward's Tales, and leaving a comment below. Tell us what part moved you the most. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about love, resilience, and the true meaning of family, share this video with them. Your support keeps these stories alive.